The coffee cup trembled against the saucer, its porcelain rim catching the harsh fluorescent light of the airport diner. Marcus Holloway didn't notice the small earthquake in his hands. His attention was fixed on the phone pressed against his ear, the voice on the other end delivering numbers that made his jaw clench tighter with each syllable. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The Singapore deal fell through. His CFO's voice crackled through the static. We're looking at a $40 million loss, Marcus. The board is calling for an emergency meeting. Outside the grease-stained windows, rain hammered the tarmac of Millfield Regional Airport, a small hub that served the industrial corridor between two major cities. Lightning split the gray December sky, illuminating the sleek outline of Marcus's private Gulfstream G650, its white fuselage gleaming like a beacon of corporate power against the storm. The jet represented everything he'd built over 23 years. Holloway Industries, a manufacturing empire that employed 12,000 people across 4 states. But empires, Marcus had learned, could crumble in a single phone call. "How long do I have?" Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The diner's ambient noise, the sizzle of bacon on the griddle, the murmur of conversations and the clatter of silverware seemed to fade into white noise around him. "The board meets at 9 a.m. tomorrow. If you're not there..." Marcus closed his eyes. 23 years of 16-hour days, of missed birthdays and forgotten anniversaries, of building something that mattered. His wife Sarah had died 3 years ago, never seeing him slow down enough to truly live. Now their daughter Emma, 25, and working as a pediatric nurse in Seattle, barely spoke to him. The business had cost him everything personal, and now it threatened to cost him everything professional, too. "I'll be there," he said, ending the call. The diner occupied a forgotten corner of the terminal, its red vinyl booths cracked with age and its checkerboard linoleum floor worn smooth by decades of hurried travelers. A jukebox in the corner played soft jazz, its mellowed tones a stark contrast to the storm raging outside. The place smelled of old coffee and grilled onions, with an undertone of jet fuel that never quite disappeared in airports. Marcus had been coming here for 15 years, ever since he'd started flying private. It wasn't about the food, though Martha's apple pie was legendary among the pilots who frequented the place. It was about the ritual, the brief pause between the chaos of business and the solitude of flight. Here, in this unremarkable space, he could pretend to be just another traveler instead of the man whose decisions affected thousands of livelihoods. "Another coffee, Mr. Holloway." The voice belonged to Rita Vasquez, a waitress who had been serving him for the better part of a decade. She was perhaps 50, with silver threads weaving through her black hair and laugh lines that spoke of someone who'd found ways to smile despite life's hardships. Her uniform, a simple blue dress with a white apron, was immaculate despite the busy dinner rush. Rita had 3 children and 2 grandchildren. Marcus knew this because she'd shown him pictures over the years, proud snapshots pulled from her apron pocket during quiet moments. Her eldest son was studying engineering at the state university. Her daughter worked as a teacher. Her youngest was serving in the army overseas. Rita worked double shifts to help with tuition and to send care packages to her soldier son. "Please," Marcus nodded, pushing the cup toward her. His hands had steadied, but his mind continued racing through contingencies and backup plans. Rita poured the coffee with the practiced grace of someone who'd performed the motion thousands of times. Steam rose from the dark liquid, carrying the rich aroma that had become synonymous with these transitional moments in Marcus's life. But tonight, something felt different. Rita didn't move away after filling his cup. Instead, she lingered, her eyes focused on something beyond the window. "Storm's getting worse," she observed, but her tone carried an undercurrent that made Marcus look up from his phone. "The weather service says it should pass by midnight," Marcus replied absently, already checking his pilot's latest message. Captain James Morrison had been flying for Holloway Industries for 8 years.
reliable, experienced, with over 15,000 hours of flight time and an impeccable safety record. If Morrison said they could make it to Chicago despite the weather, Marcus trusted his judgment. But Rita wasn't looking at the storm clouds. Her gaze was fixed on the tarmac, where a figure in a pilot's uniform was walking toward Marcus's aircraft. Even through the rain-streaked window, something about the man's gait seemed wrong. Too casual, too loose for someone preparing for a challenging flight in dangerous conditions. "Mr. Holloway," Rita said quietly, her voice taking on a tone Marcus had never heard before. "That pilot walking to your plane? That isn't Captain Morrison." Marcus's blood went cold. He looked up sharply, following Rita's gaze through the window. The figure was still distant, partially obscured by rain and the limited visibility, but Rita was right. Something was off. The height was wrong, the build too slight. Morrison was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a distinctive confident stride. This person moved differently, with a nervous energy that seemed at odds with the professional demeanor Marcus expected from his flight crew. "What do you mean?" Marcus asked, though his instincts were already screaming warnings. Rita's expression had grown serious, almost protective. She'd worked at this airport long enough to recognize most of the regular pilots, especially those who flew the expensive private jets. Morrison always stopped by for coffee before long flights, always tipped generously, and always took a moment to ask about his family. More importantly, Rita had developed an intuition about people, a survival skill honed by years of dealing with travelers in all states of stress, intoxication, and desperation. She said, "I've been watching that man for the past hour," her voice low enough that other diners couldn't overhear. "He's been pacing near the pilot's lounge, checking his phone constantly, and he keeps looking around like he's worried about being seen. That's not how Captain Morrison behaves. Morrison is calm, methodical, he has a routine." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. In the business world, he learned to trust unexpected warnings, especially from people who had no apparent agenda. Rita had nothing to gain by lying to him and everything to lose by interfering with a wealthy customer's travel plans. If she was taking this risk, she believed the danger was real. "Are you certain it's not Morrison?" Marcus asked, already reaching for his phone. "Mr. Holloway, I've served that man coffee probably 100 times over the years. He's got a scar on his left hand from a childhood accident, and he always wears a St. Christopher pendant. His wife gave it to him after their first child was born. He's told me that story. The man walking to your plane doesn't move like Morrison, and from what I can see, he's younger, maybe in his 30s instead of Morrison's late 40s. Through the window, the figure had reached the aircraft and was beginning his pre-flight inspection. But even from a distance, his movements seemed rushed, perfunctory. Morrison was famous for his meticulous pre-flight routines, often spending 45 minutes checking every system twice. This person appeared to be going through the motions without Morrison's characteristic attention to detail. Marcus's mind raced through possibilities, each more troubling than the last. Corporate espionage was rare but not unheard of in his industry. Holloway Industries held several defense contracts, and the Singapore deal that had just collapsed involved sensitive manufacturing processes that competitors would pay handsomely to access. But this felt more immediate, more dangerous than industrial spying. "Rita," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the growing alarm, "I need you to call airport security. Tell them there's a suspicious person attempting to access a private aircraft without authorization." But Rita was already ahead of him. She'd pulled out her cell phone and was dialing a number from memory. "Jake? It's Rita from the diner. I need you to check out the Gulfstream on pad 7. No, this isn't about noise complaints. Something's wrong with the pilot." Jake Reyes was the head of security for Millfield, a former police officer who'd taken the airport job after a knee injury ended his patrol career. Rita had known him for 6 years, ever since he'd started stopping by the diner doing his rounds. He was thorough, professional, and, most importantly, he trusted Rita's instincts. As Rita spoke quietly into the phone, Marcus found himself studying her face. The laugh lines were still there, but they were overshadowed now by an expression of genuine concern. This wasn't idle gossip or casual observation. Rita believed something was seriously wrong, and her certainty was infectious. "Jake's on his way," Rita said, closing her phone. "But, Mr. Holloway, I think you should consider postponing your flight. This storm is only going to get worse, and if that isn't your regular pilot—" Marcus nodded, his business instincts warring with a growing sense that Rita had just saved him from something far worse than a missed board meeting. Outside, the figure near his aircraft had stopped moving, as if he'd noticed the approaching security vehicle. Even through the rain and distance, his body language had changed, tense, alert, ready to run. "Rita," Marcus said quietly, "how long have you been watching him?" "Since about 6:30. He showed up in a taxi, paid cash, and immediately started asking questions about private flights. Martha, she works at the counter, said he seemed nervous, kept checking his watch. Then he went to the pilot's lounge, but he didn't socialize with the other crews. Morrison always does. He's friendly, knows everyone. This man sat alone, made phone calls, and kept watching the door like he was expecting trouble." The security vehicle's flashing lights cut through the rain, reflecting off the wet tarmac in red and blue streaks. Through the diner's window, Marcus could see Jake Reyes approaching the aircraft, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The figure near the Gulf Stream had straightened, his posture defensive. Marcus's phone buzzed with an incoming call. The caller ID showed Morrison's number, and Marcus answered immediately. "Captain Morrison, where are you?" "Mr. Holloway?" Morrison's voice sounded strained, distant. "I'm at Chicago General Hospital. I was in a car accident about 2 hours ago. Someone ran a red light and T-boned my sedan. I've been trying to call you, but the cell towers are overloaded because of the storm." The pieces clicked into place with terrifying clarity. Someone had been waiting for Morrison to be incapacitated. The timing was too perfect, too convenient. This wasn't random corporate espionage or opportunistic theft. This was a coordinated operation, and Marcus was walking directly into it. "Are you all right?" Marcus asked, though his attention was now fixed on the scene outside. "Broken ribs? Concussion? But I'll live. Mr. Holloway, I need to ask you something important. Did anyone contact you about a replacement pilot for tonight's flight?" "No," Marcus replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "But there's someone at my aircraft right now preparing for takeoff." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. When Morrison spoke again, his voice carried the weight of 15,000 hours of flight experience and an intimate knowledge of how these situations could unfold.
"Mr. Holloway, get away from that plane right now. Call the FBI, call the FAA, call anyone with authority, but do not get on that aircraft." Through the window, Marcus could see Jake Reyes in conversation with the imposter pilot. Even from a distance, the body language told a clear story. Jake's authoritative stance, the imposter's increasingly defensive posture. Then, suddenly, the fake pilot broke away from the conversation and started running across the tarmac, his uniform jacket flapping in the wind. Rita had been watching the scene unfold with the intensity of someone who understood that her quick thinking might have prevented a tragedy. Now, as the imposter fled into the night, she turned to Marcus with an expression that mixed relief with lingering concern. "Mr. Holloway," she said quietly, "I think you need to ask yourself who knew about your travel plans tonight, because someone wanted you on that plane, and it wasn't because they wanted to give you a safe flight to Chicago." The coffee cup sat forgotten on the table, its contents growing cold as Marcus confronted a reality that would have been unthinkable just an hour earlier. Someone had tried to kill him. The Singapore deal, the emergency board meeting, the pressure to fly through dangerous weather. It had all been orchestrated to get him alone on that aircraft with a pilot who had no intention of delivering him safely to his destination. But who? And why? The questions multiplied faster than answers, each possibility more troubling than the last. As the security lights continued to flash across the rain-soaked tarmac, Marcus realized that Rita Vasquez, a waitress who earned her living serving coffee and taking orders, had just saved his life with nothing more than careful observation and the courage to speak up when something felt wrong. The storm outside was beginning to weaken, but Marcus knew that the real tempest was just beginning. The next morning found Marcus in an unfamiliar place, his own kitchen, watching the sun rise through windows that he rarely had time to appreciate. The events at the airport had shaken him more than he cared to admit, not just because of the immediate danger, but because of what Rita's intervention had revealed about his life. For 15 years, she'd been observing him, learning his patterns, caring enough to notice when something was wrong. Meanwhile, he could barely remember the last meaningful conversation he'd had with his own daughter. Emma had called at 6 a.m., her voice tight with worry after seeing the news reports about the incident at Millfield Regional. The story had broken overnight. Corporate executive narrowly escapes assassination attempt. The FBI had taken over the investigation after discovering that the imposter pilot was connected to a larger conspiracy involving Marcus's business dealings overseas. "Dad, are you okay? Really okay?" Emma's voice carried across the country from her apartment in Seattle, where she was probably getting ready for another 12-hour shift at Children's Hospital. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Shaken, but fine. I found myself studying my reflection in the kitchen window. At 57, he looked older than his years. The stress of building and running Holloway Industries had carved deep lines around his eyes and turned his once dark hair silver. When had that happened? When had he become this tired-looking stranger? Dad, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest. How many enemies do you have?" The question hit him like a physical blow. Emma was direct, a trait she had inherited from her mother, but this level of concern was new. They'd grown apart after Sarah's death, their relationship reduced to obligatory holiday calls and birthday cards. Now, faced with the possibility that he might have been killed, Emma was asking questions that he'd been avoiding for years. "I don't know," Marcus admitted. "I thought I was just a businessman, but apparently I was naive." Over the years, Holloway Industries had grown from a small manufacturing company into a major player in aerospace components and defense contracting. The Singapore deal that had fallen through involved producing specialized parts for military aircraft, a contract worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Marcus had assumed the competitors who lost out were disappointed, but professional. He'd never considered that someone might be willing to kill for that kind of money. "Dad, I'm flying out today. Don't argue with me. I'm coming home." "Emma, you don't need to—" "Yes, I do. Someone tried to kill you yesterday, and the only reason you're alive is because a waitress cared enough to pay attention. That tells me everything I need to know about how isolated you've become."
After Emma hung up, Marcus sat in the silence of his too-large house, contemplating the truth in her words. The mansion in Glenbrook Estates had 12 rooms and sat on 4 acres of manicured grounds. Sarah had chosen it 20 years ago, envisioning it filled with children's laughter and holiday gatherings. Instead, it had become a mausoleum to Marcus's ambitions, its rooms echoing with the absence of the life they'd never fully lived. Marcus walked through the house, seeing it as Emma might when she arrived, the formal living room where they'd never entertained, because Marcus was always working. The dining room, where they'd eaten maybe a dozen family meals, because Marcus was usually at the office. The home theater where Sarah had watched movies alone, because Marcus was traveling. Each room was a testament to good intentions and missed opportunities. In his study, Marcus found the folder of newspaper clippings that Sarah had kept during the early years of the business. Headlines from the local paper. Local entrepreneur lands major contract. Holloway Industries brings jobs to region. Manufacturing renaissance led by local visionary. Sarah had been so proud of his success, so supportive of his dreams. She'd believed they were building something together, a legacy for Emma and the grandchildren they'd planned to have. But success had been a jealous mistress. Each achievement had demanded greater sacrifice, longer hours, more travel, higher stakes. Sarah had waited patiently for him to slow down, to find balance, to remember that businesses could be rebuilt, but time with family was irreplaceable. She'd waited until the cancer diagnosis, and even then she'd been more concerned about his stress than her own prognosis. The funeral had been the largest in the county's history. Representatives from dozens of companies, hundreds of employees, politicians, and community leaders. Everyone had spoken about Marcus's achievements, his contributions to the local economy, his generosity to various charities. But Emma had given the eulogy, and her words had been about Sarah the person, not Sarah the businessman's wife. She'd talked about her mother's garden, her volunteer work at the animal shelter, her ability to make anyone feel welcome in their home. She'd painted a picture of a woman who'd lived fully, despite being married to a man who was always chasing the next deal. Now, 3 years later, Marcus was beginning to understand what Emma had tried to tell him that day. Success without relationships was just elaborate loneliness. Rita Vasquez, a woman who served coffee for a living, cared enough to save his life. Meanwhile, he couldn't remember the last time he'd asked Emma about her work, her dreams, her life, beyond their perfunctory phone calls. The morning passed slowly, a luxury Marcus hadn't experienced in decades. He found himself doing things he'd forgotten how to do, reading the newspaper cover to cover, making breakfast instead of grabbing coffee and a protein bar, actually tasting his food. The forced stillness felt strange, like learning to breathe underwater, but it also felt necessary. At 10 a.m., FBI agent Sarah Chen arrived with updates on the investigation. She was younger than Emma, maybe 30, with the intense focus of someone accustomed to dealing with life-and-death situations. Agent Chen had the presence that filled a room, commanding attention without raising her voice. "Mr. Holloway, we've identified the imposter pilot. His name is David Carver, former military, discharged under questionable circumstances 5 years ago. He's been working as a freelance pilot since then, mostly cargo runs and charter flights. Someone paid him $50,000 to pose as Captain Morrison and take you on what you believed was a routine flight to Chicago." Marcus poured coffee for both of them, a domestic gesture that felt foreign in the context of discussing his attempted murder. "Do we know who hired him?" "We're working on that. Carver was paid through a series of shell companies that are proving difficult to trace. However, we do know that whomever orchestrated this had detailed knowledge of
your travel plans, your regular pilot schedule, and your routines. This wasn't random, Mr. Holloway. Someone has been watching you for months, maybe longer." The implications were terrifying. Marcus thought about all the late-night flights, the business trips to isolated locations, the meetings in foreign countries where American law enforcement had no jurisdiction. How many times had he been vulnerable without knowing it? "There's something else," Agent Chen continued. "We found evidence that Captain Morrison's accident wasn't actually an accident. The other driver ran a red light deliberately, timing the collision to disable Morrison without killing him. They needed him alive so that he couldn't be replaced immediately, but incapacitated so that he couldn't fly. It's a sophisticated operation, Mr. Holloway, professional." Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the December weather outside. Morrison has a family, wife, 2 young children. We've already placed them in protective custody. If someone was willing to orchestrate his accident, they might be willing to use his family as leverage. Agent Chen's expression softened slightly. Mr. Holloway, I need to ask you about your business dealings, the Singapore contract, your competitors, any recent conflicts or negotiations that might have created enemies. For the next 2 hours, Marcus walked Agent Chen through the complex web of international business relationships that defined his professional life. The Singapore deal involved 3 major competitors, each capable of fielding sophisticated operations. There were also the environmental groups that opposed some of his manufacturing processes, though their tactics had never escalated beyond protests and lawsuits. Political opponents of his defense contracts, though they usually worked through legislative channels rather than direct action. But as Marcus talked, he began to realize how little he actually knew about the people he did business with. Names on contracts, voices on conference calls, handshakes at industry events. He'd built an empire on relationships that were essentially transactional, lacking the personal connections that might have warned him of emerging threats. Mr. Holloway, I need you to consider the possibility that this attack was designed not just to kill you, but to send a message to others in your industry. Corporate assassination is rare in the United States, but it's becoming more common globally. If someone succeeded in killing a prominent American businessman in an untraceable way, it would change the entire landscape of how business is conducted. After Agent Chen left, Marcus found himself back in the kitchen staring out at the winter garden that Sarah had planted years ago. The roses were dormant, their branches bare against the gray sky, but she'd chosen varieties that would bloom again in spring. Even in death, Sarah was still contributing to the beauty of their home, still giving life to something meaningful. Emma called again at noon, this time from the airport in Seattle. My flight lands at 4. Don't send a car. I'll rent one. And Dad, I want to meet Rita Vasquez. The woman who saved your life deserves to know how grateful our family is. Emma, she was just doing what she thought was right. Exactly. When's the last time you could say that about someone in your business world? The question lingered long after Emma hung up. Marcus thought about the hundreds of people who worked for him, the suppliers and contractors and business partners who depended on Holloway Industries. How many of them would risk their own comfort to save his life? How many would even notice if something seemed wrong? Rita Vasquez had noticed because she had taken the time to see him as a person rather than just a customer. She learned his habits, his preferences, his schedule. She cared enough to observe and remember to act when her instincts told her something was wrong. In a world where Marcus was surrounded by people paid to pay attention to him, the person who saved his life was someone he'd barely acknowledged beyond polite small talk. That afternoon, Marcus did something he hadn't done in years. He took a walk through his neighborhood. Glenbrook Estates was an enclave of successful professionals, their large homes set back from tree-lined streets that curved through rolling hills. He'd lived here for 15 years, but realized he didn't know any of his neighbors beyond nodding acknowledgments when they collected their mail. The walk took him past the elementary school where Emma had attended kindergarten, back when Sarah would volunteer as a reading tutor, and Marcus would occasionally make it to school plays and parent-teacher conferences. He remembered Emma at 6 years old, gap-toothed and excited about everything, convinced that her daddy could solve any problem and make any dream come true. When did he stop being that person in her eyes? As he walked, Marcus thought about Rita's 3 children and how proudly she spoke of their accomplishments. Her oldest son, studying engineering, probably worked harder for his education than Marcus ever had. Her daughter, teaching in an underfunded public school, was making a difference in children's lives every day. Her youngest, serving overseas, was risking his life for principles larger than profit margins. Rita had raised 3 children who contributed to the world in meaningful ways, and she'd done it while working double shifts and worrying about money. What legacy was Marcus leaving? Holloway Industries employed thousands of people and generated millions in tax revenue, but would anyone remember him as more than a successful businessman? Would Emma tell her children stories about their grandfather's character, his kindness, his wisdom, or would he be remembered primarily for his achievements and his absence? The sun was setting by the time Marcus returned home, painting the winter sky in shades of orange and purple that he'd forgotten how to notice. Emma's rental car was in the driveway, a compact sedan that seemed impossibly small compared to the luxury vehicles Marcus was accustomed to. Through the kitchen window, he could see her moving around, probably making the first home-cooked meal the house had seen in months. Emma had inherited Sarah's auburn hair and green eyes, but she'd developed her own presence over the years, a quiet strength that came from choosing a profession dedicated to healing rather than accumulating wealth. At 25, she was already a supervisor in the pediatric ICU, trusted with life-and-death decisions that made Marcus's business challenges seem trivial by comparison. "Hey, Dad," she said as he entered the kitchen. The smell of homemade soup filled the air, an aroma that transported Marcus back to the early years of their marriage, when Sarah would have dinner waiting no matter how late he worked. "You didn't have to cook," Marcus said, though he was grateful for the gesture. "I wanted to. Besides, I called Rita Vasquez while you were out. She's coming by tonight, and I thought we should feed her properly." Emma's tone carried a gentle reproach. "When's the last time you had a real meal, Dad? Not something from a hotel room service or grabbed between meetings." Marcus couldn't remember. Food had become fuel, consumed efficiently while multitasking. He'd forgotten that meals could be social occasions, opportunities for connection and conversation. "Emma, I need to tell you something. Yesterday, when Rita warned me about that pilot, I realized something. She knew more about my routines, my preferences, my life than most of the people who work for me. A waitress who I see maybe once a month cared enough to save my life, while I can't remember the last time I had a meaningful conversation with someone who works for me every day." Emma stopped stirring the soup and looked at her father with an expression that mixed love with long-standing frustration. "Dad, do you want to know why Mom never complained about your work schedule, even when it meant you missed birthdays and anniversaries and holidays? Because she understood how important the business was?" "No, because she knew that complaining wouldn't change anything. You'd made your choice and she'd made hers. She chose to love you anyway, to support your dreams even when they didn't include her. But she also made me promise something before she died." Marcus felt his chest tighten. Sarah had made Emma promise something about him, something she'd never shared. "She made me promise to tell you the truth if you ever seemed ready to hear it. The truth is, Dad, you're a good man who forgot how to live. You're generous and ethical and brilliant, but you're also lonely in ways you don't even recognize. Yesterday, a stranger saved your life. Today, you're discovering that you don't really know your own neighbors, your own employees, even your own daughter. That's not success, Dad. That's a tragedy."
The words hit Marcus like a physical blow, but they carried the ring of truth that he'd been avoiding for years. Emma wasn't attacking him. She was trying to save him from a different kind of death, the slow suffocation that came from achieving everything you'd ever wanted while losing everything that actually mattered. Rita Vasquez arrived at 7 p.m. sharp, carrying a covered dish and wearing the same careful dignity that Marcus had observed at the airport diner. She'd changed from her work uniform into a simple blue dress and cardigan, her silver hair neatly arranged, her manner quiet but confident. Emma greeted her at the door with a warmth that immediately put Rita at ease, leading her into the kitchen where the smell of homemade soup mingled with the aroma of Rita's contribution, fresh-baked cornbread that would have been worthy of any five-star restaurant. "Mrs. Vasquez, I can't begin to thank you for what you did," Marcus said, rising from his chair as she entered. "You saved my life." Rita's cheeks colored slightly at the formal address and the obvious gratitude. "Please, call me Rita. And you don't need to thank me, Mr. Holloway. I just did what felt right." "That's exactly why we need to thank you," Emma interjected, setting another place at the kitchen table. "In my experience, most people don't do what feels right when it might be inconvenient or complicated." As they shared the meal, Rita's story emerged in gentle fragments. She'd been working at the airport for 12 years, ever since her husband Miguel died in a construction accident. Before that, she'd been a stay-at-home mother, raising her 3 children and managing the household, while Miguel built his reputation as one of the most reliable contractors in the region. His death had thrust her into the workforce at 38, with no formal job experience and 3 children depending on her. "The airport job wasn't what I'd planned for my life," Rita explained, her hands wrapped around a coffee cup that Emma kept refilling. "But it was steady work with good benefits, and the hours meant I could still be home when the kids got out of school. Plus, I discovered I liked the work. Every day brought different people with different stories. Travelers going home to families, business people chasing dreams, couples starting honeymoons. There's something hopeful about airports, even the small ones like Millfield." Emma had positioned herself across from Rita, listening with the focused attention of someone accustomed to hearing difficult stories. "How did you know something was wrong with that pilot?" "Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you're enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel." Rita considered the question carefully, as if she'd been asking herself the same thing. It wasn't any one thing. It was the combination, the way he moved, like he was performing being a pilot rather than actually being one. The fact that he avoided the other pilots. Captain Morrison always talks shop with the other crews. The nervous energy, the constant phone checking. But mostly it was instinct. When you've worked in service jobs for 12 years, you develop a sense about people. You learn to read anxiety, deception, danger. Marcus found himself studying Rita's face as she spoke, seeing details he'd never noticed during their brief interactions at the diner. The intelligence in her eyes, the careful way she chose her words, the quiet confidence that came from making difficult decisions under pressure. This wasn't just a kind waitress who'd happened to notice something wrong. This was a woman who'd spent years observing human nature, developing survival skills that ultimately saved his life. "Rita," Marcus said slowly, "would you be willing to help me with something?" Emma shot her father a warning look, but Marcus continued. "Agent Chen told me that whoever orchestrated yesterday's attack had detailed knowledge of my routines and travel patterns. Someone has been watching me for months, maybe longer. You've been observing me for 15 years, albeit for different reasons. I need to understand what you've seen, what patterns might be visible to someone studying my behavior." Rita set down her coffee cup, her expression growing serious. "Mr. Holloway, are you asking me to help catch the people who tried to kill you?"
I'm asking for your perspective. The FBI will handle the investigation, but they're approaching this from a law enforcement angle. You see things differently. You notice details that trained investigators might miss. Emma leaned forward, her concern evident. "Dad, you can't ask Rita to put herself at risk." "I'm not. I'm asking her to share observations she's already made, to help us understand how vulnerable I've been without realizing it." Rita was quiet for several minutes, clearly wrestling with the request. Finally, she spoke. "Mr. Holloway, if I help you, it's not because I want to get involved in something dangerous. It's because what happened yesterday scared me. Not just for you, but for all of us who work at that airport. If someone can orchestrate that kind of operation once, they can do it again. Other people could get hurt." Over the next 2 hours, Rita painted a detailed picture of Marcus's travel patterns that was both impressive and disturbing. She knew which flights required early morning departures, which trips were planned weeks in advance versus last-minute emergency travel. She'd observed his stress levels, his phone conversations, even his interactions with Captain Morrison. More importantly, she'd noticed things that Marcus himself had forgotten. 3 months ago, there was a man in the diner who seemed very interested in your conversation with Captain Morrison. You were discussing the weather delays that had been affecting your Singapore meetings. This man, middle-aged, dark hair, expensive suit, but trying to look casual, sat 2 booths away and ordered coffee but never touched it. He left right after you did, and I never saw him again. Marcus felt a chill. The timeline aligned perfectly with the early stages of the Singapore negotiations, when the stakes were still unclear and the competition was just beginning to intensify. Did you report this to airport security? I mentioned it to Jake Reyes, but there wasn't really anything to report. A man drinking coffee in a public diner isn't suspicious behavior. It was just a feeling I had. Emma had been taking notes, her nursing background making her comfortable with detailed record-keeping. Rita, you mentioned that Captain Morrison has routines. What kind of routines? Very specific ones. He always arrives exactly 90 minutes before departure. He orders the same meal, turkey sandwich on wheat bread, no mustard, and black coffee. He spends 20 minutes eating, then checks the weather reports on his phone, then calls his wife. After that, he does his pre-flight inspection, which takes about 45 minutes. He's incredibly methodical. So someone planning to replace him would need to know his schedule precisely. More than that, Rita continued, they'd need to know when he left his apartment, what route he took to the airport, where he was most vulnerable. The car accident that took him out wasn't random timing. Someone had been studying his life as carefully as they'd been studying yours. The weight of this revelation settled over the kitchen like a physical presence. Marcus had assumed he was the primary target, but the operation had required intimate knowledge of multiple people's lives and routines. Captain Morrison, Rita, even the security staff at Millfield Regional. Someone had been mapping an entire network of relationships and dependencies. Emma's phone buzzed with an incoming call. She glanced at the screen, then looked at her father with surprise. It's Agent Chen. She's calling you, but the call is coming to my phone. Marcus's blood pressure spiked. Answer it.
Miss Holloway. Agent Chen's voice carried an urgency that immediately put everyone on edge. I need to speak with your father immediately, but his phone appears to be compromised. We've detected unusual activity on his cellular and landline accounts. Emma handed the phone to Marcus, who felt a familiar chill of vulnerability. Agent Chen, what kind of activity? Someone has been monitoring your communications for at least 6 weeks, possibly longer. They have access to your call logs, text messages, and potentially your emails. We discovered this when we tried to trace the communications used to coordinate yesterday's operation. Mr. Holloway, you need to assume that whoever is behind this knows everything about your business, your travel plans, and your personal relationships. Rita had gone pale, understanding the implications immediately. If they'd been listening to his phone calls, they might know that I identified the fake pilot. They might know that I'm here with him right now. Agent Chen's voice became even more urgent. Miss Vasquez, where are you currently? At Mr. Holloway's house. I need all of you to leave that location immediately. Don't pack anything. Don't follow your normal routines. Take separate vehicles and go to different locations. I'm sending backup to your current address, but you can't wait for us to arrive. The next 20 minutes passed in a blur of controlled panic. Emma grabbed her purse and keys, while Marcus found his wallet and the emergency cash he kept in his study safe. Rita had gone pale, understanding the implications immediately. As they prepared to leave, Marcus's landline rang. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, but something compelled him to answer. Mr. Holloway. The voice was electronically distorted, clearly disguised. You've become quite troublesome. Emma and Rita stopped moving, both women recognizing the shift in Marcus's demeanor as he gripped the phone. Who is this? Someone who invested considerable time and money in a solution that you've managed to complicate. The Waitress was not part of our calculations. Marcus felt a surge of protective anger. Leave Rita out of this. Your quarrel is with me. Our quarrel, Mr. Holloway, is with your continued existence. Yesterday's failure was an expensive setback, but hardly insurmountable. However, we're disappointed that you've chosen to involve law enforcement. That complicates things unnecessarily. What do you want? What we've always wanted. The Singapore contracts, the Defense Department relationships, and the infrastructure you've built over 23 years. Your death would have been efficient, a tragic accident that would have allowed us to acquire Holloway Industries at a fraction of its value. Now we'll need to be more creative. The line went dead, leaving Marcus staring at the phone with a mixture of fury and fear. The caller had confirmed what he'd begun to suspect. This wasn't about eliminating a business rival. This was about corporate acquisition through murder, a hostile takeover that would have left Emma inheriting a compromised company and the people responsible controlling his life's work.
"We need to go now," Emma said, her nursing training helping her maintain focus despite the obvious danger. "Rita, do you have somewhere safe to stay? Somewhere they wouldn't think to look?" Rita nodded, though her hands were shaking slightly. "My sister lives in Millbrook, about an hour away. I could stay with her." "Good. Dad, what about you?" Marcus thought quickly through his options. His usual haunts, hotels, business associates' homes, even his private club would be too predictable. But there was one place that might work, at least temporarily. The lake house. Your mother and I bought it 15 years ago, but I haven't been there in over a year. It's registered under a trust that doesn't bear the Holloway name directly. As they prepared to leave through separate exits, Rita turned to Marcus with an expression that mixed determination with fear. "Mr. Holloway, I need you to understand something. What I did yesterday wasn't heroic, it was just paying attention. But now that these people know about me, I can't just pretend this isn't happening. They threatened you on the phone, but they also threatened me by implication. I've spent 12 years building a safe life for my children, and I won't let anyone destroy that." "Rita, what are you saying?" "I'm saying that I want to help catch them. Not because I'm brave, but because I'm scared. Scared for my family, scared for the other people who work at that airport, scared for anyone else who might get caught up in this. These people are willing to kill innocent people to steal a business. They need to be stopped." Emma looked between Rita and her father, recognizing the same stubborn determination that had driven Marcus to build his empire. "If we're going to do this, we need to be smart about it. No heroism, no unnecessary risks. We help the FBI, but we don't try to solve this ourselves." 20 minutes later, they were driving in different directions through the December night, each lost in their own thoughts about how quickly their lives had changed. Marcus drove toward the lake house through back roads he hadn't traveled in years, thinking about the conversation with the electronically disguised voice. The caller had known about Rita's intervention, had known about the FBI involvement, even known that Marcus was at home rather than at a hotel or safe house. Their surveillance was comprehensive and ongoing. But the caller had also revealed something important. This was more than personal revenge or business competition. Someone wanted to acquire Holloway Industries, and they'd been willing to commit murder to make it happen. The Singapore deal hadn't just fallen through, it had been sabotaged as part of a larger plan to destabilize the company and create acquisition opportunities. The lake house sat on 12 acres of wooded property, accessible only through a private road that wound through dense forest. Marcus and Sarah had bought it as a weekend retreat, imagining family vacations and quiet summers away from the business world. Instead, it had become another symbol of good intentions undermined by Marcus's relentless focus on work. Sarah had spent weekends there alone, reading books and tending a small garden while Marcus dealt with one crisis after another. Now, as Marcus unlocked the door and stepped into the musty interior, he could almost hear Sarah's voice encouraging him to slow down, to appreciate what they'd built together rather than constantly chasing the next achievement. The house was simply furnished but comfortable, with large windows overlooking the lake and a stone fireplace that Sarah had insisted on despite Marcus's protests about the cost. His phone, a new burner phone that Agent Chen had provided, buzzed with a text message from Emma. "Safe at secure location. Rita is with her sister. Check in every 2 hours."
Marcus built a fire and sat in the chair where Sarah used to read, looking out at the lake and thinking about the path that had brought him to this moment. 24 hours ago, he was a successful businessman facing a financial crisis. Now he was a potential murder victim hiding in his own lake house, dependent on a waitress and his estranged daughter for emotional support, while professional killers planned their next move.
But something had changed during the conversation with Rita and Emma. For the first time in years, Marcus felt connected to something larger than his immediate business concerns. Rita's courage in speaking up, Emma's determination to protect him, Agent Chen's commitment to finding the truth, these relationships felt more substantial than the transactional partnerships that had defined his professional life. His phone rang, displaying Agent Chen's number. "Mr. Holloway, we've made some progress on tracing the electronic surveillance of your communications. The operation is more sophisticated than we initially thought. Whoever is behind this has access to high-level cybersecurity resources, the kind usually associated with state actors or very well-funded criminal organizations." "Agent Chen, the caller who contacted me tonight mentioned acquiring Holloway Industries at a fraction of its value. This isn't just about eliminating me. It's about stealing my company." "That's consistent with what we're discovering. We've identified at least 3 shell companies that have been quietly acquiring debt instruments related to your business over the past 18 months. If you had died in that plane crash, the resulting financial chaos would have made your company vulnerable to a hostile takeover at deeply discounted prices." Marcus felt a surge of anger, mixed with admiration for the sophistication of the plan. Someone had been orchestrating a multi-year operation designed to destroy his life's work while making themselves wealthy in the process. The Singapore deal, the financial pressures, even the timing of the emergency board meeting, all of it had been carefully calculated to put him on that plane with a killer pilot. "Do we know who's behind the shell companies?" "We're working on it. The paper trail leads through multiple jurisdictions, but we have some promising leads. Mr. Holloway, I need to ask you about your competitors on the Singapore deal, specifically about Phoenix Dynamics and Meridian Aerospace." Marcus knew both companies well. Phoenix Dynamics was run by his former business partner, Thomas Archer, who'd left Holloway Industries 15 years ago after a bitter dispute over the company's direction. Meridian Aerospace was a newer player in the market, but they'd been aggressive in pursuing defense contracts, often underbidding established companies by unsustainable margins. "Thomas Archer and I haven't spoken in 10 years, but I can't imagine him orchestrating something like this. He's ruthless in business, but murder isn't his style." "What about Meridian Aerospace?" "Less familiar with their leadership, but they've been acquiring smaller companies at an unusual rate. If someone wanted to build a platform for taking over larger companies like mine, Meridian would be a logical front." Agent Chen was quiet for a moment. "Mr. Holloway, we're going to need detailed information about your business relationships, your competitors, and anyone who might have access to your travel schedules and communication patterns. But I don't want you to compile this information alone. The people who tried to kill you are still active, and they've demonstrated their willingness to harm innocent people to achieve their goals." After the call ended, Marcus found himself thinking about Thomas Archer for the first time in years. They'd been partners in the early days of Holloway Industries, when the company was just Marcus's engineering expertise and Thomas's business acumen operating out of a rented warehouse. For 5 years, they'd built something remarkable together, combining their complementary skills to win contracts that neither could have secured alone. But success had revealed fundamental differences in their values and vision. Thomas had wanted to maximize short-term profits, even if it meant cutting corners on quality or safety. Marcus had insisted on maintaining the highest standards, even when it cost them business.
The dispute had become personal, then bitter, ultimately ending with Thomas's departure and a non-compete agreement that had kept them in separate markets for a decade. Thomas had gone on to build Phoenix Dynamics into a major player in the industry, using aggressive tactics and cost-cutting measures that Marcus wouldn't have considered. But murder? Even allowing for the years of resentment that had developed between them, Marcus couldn't imagine Thomas crossing that line. Meridian Aerospace was a different story. The company had appeared seemingly overnight, backed by anonymous investors and managed by executives with impressive resumes but questionable track records. They'd won several major contracts by submitting bids that experienced industry observers considered impossibly low, leading to speculation about their true financial backing and long-term viability. Marcus spent the next several hours going through his memories of interactions with Meridian representatives, trying to identify anything that might have seemed unusual or threatening. The more he thought about it, the more convinced he became that Meridian was connected to the attempt on his life. The timing was too perfect, the financial motives too clear, the sophistication of the operation too consistent with a company that had appeared from nowhere with unlimited resources. His phone buzzed with another text from Emma. "Dad, I've been thinking about something Rita said. She mentioned that Captain Morrison always calls his wife before flights. Did the fake pilot make any calls while he was preparing your plane?" Marcus immediately called Agent Chen to relay the question. "Agent Chen, Rita observed that Captain Morrison always calls his wife before flights. Did anyone check whether the imposter pilot made any calls while he was at the aircraft?" "That's an excellent question. Let me check with our technical team." Agent Chen was quiet for several minutes, presumably accessing files or contacting other investigators. "Mr. Holloway, you may have just given us our first real break in this case. The imposter pilot did make a call from the aircraft using the plane's communication system. We're tracing that call now." Marcus felt a surge of hope mixed with admiration for his daughter's analytical thinking. Emma had never worked in business or law enforcement, but her medical training had taught her to notice patterns and ask the right questions. In 12 hours, she'd proven herself to be a more valuable investigative partner than most of the business associates Marcus had known for years. The fire had burned down to embers, casting dancing shadows across the lake house's simple interior. Marcus could hear owls calling to each other across the water, a sound that Sarah had loved during their rare evenings here together. The isolation that had once frustrated him, no cell phone coverage, no internet access, no connection to the business world, now felt like protection, a buffer between him and the people who wanted him dead. But even here, in this temporary sanctuary, Marcus couldn't escape the implications of what he'd learned. Someone had spent years studying his life, mapping his relationships, identifying his vulnerabilities. They'd been willing to kill Captain Morrison's family if necessary, to manipulate financial markets, to corrupt multiple systems in pursuit of their goals. This wasn't just a business dispute or a personal vendetta. It was a systematic assault on everything he'd built and everyone he cared about. The real question wasn't who was behind it, but how far they were willing to go to achieve their objectives, and whether Marcus, with the help of Rita's courage and Emma's intelligence and Agent Chen's expertise, could stop them before they destroyed everything he'd spent his life trying to build. Dawn broke over the lake with the kind of pristine clarity that only came after winter storms, the water reflecting a sky painted in soft pastels that gradually deepened into the blue of full morning. Marcus had slept fitfully, waking every few hours to check the windows and listen for any sounds that didn't belong to the natural symphony of the forest. At 6 a.m., his secure phone rang with a call from Agent Chen that would change everything. "Mr. Holloway, we traced the call that the imposter pilot made from your aircraft. It went to a secure number registered to Meridian Aerospace, but the conversation was recorded automatically by the plane's communication system. We have a full transcript." Marcus sat up in the chair where he dozed, instantly alert. "What did it say?"
The imposter pilot was reporting his status to someone identified only as Control. He confirmed that he'd successfully accessed the aircraft and was prepared to execute what they called Protocol 7. Control asked about potential complications, and the pilot mentioned airport security but said he could handle it.
Then Control asked specifically about the Waitress situation. Marcus felt his chest tighten. They knew about Rita? It gets worse, Agent Chen said. Control instructed the pilot to eliminate the witness if she becomes problematic. Mr. Holloway, they were prepared to kill Rita Vasquez to protect their operation. When she spoke up and called security, she didn't just save your life, she saved her own. The implications hit Marcus like a physical blow. Rita's courage hadn't just prevented his murder, it had prevented her own. If she'd remained silent, if she'd decided that her observations weren't worth the risk of getting involved, she would have watched Marcus board that plane and then been killed to ensure her silence. The people behind this operation had planned multiple murders with the same cold calculation that others might use to plan a business merger. Agent Chen, have you warned Rita about this? We've already moved her to a secure location. Her sister's house wasn't safe once we realized how comprehensive their surveillance capabilities are. We've also placed her children under protective custody. Marcus closed his eyes, overwhelmed by guilt and gratitude in equal measure. Rita's courage hadn't just prevented his murder, it had prevented her own. If she'd remained silent, if she'd decided that her observations weren't worth the risk of getting involved, she would have watched Marcus board that plane and then been killed to ensure her silence. The people behind this operation had planned multiple murders with the same cold calculation that others might use to plan a business merger. Agent Chen, have you warned Rita about this? We've already moved her to a secure location. Her sister's house wasn't safe once we realized how comprehensive their surveillance capabilities are. We've also placed her children under protective custody. Marcus closed his eyes, overwhelmed by guilt and gratitude in equal measure. Rita's courage hadn't just prevented his murder, it had prevented her own. There's more, Agent Chen continued. The technical analysis of your communication surveillance has revealed something disturbing. The operation against you has been active for almost 3 years, not 6 weeks as we initially thought. They've been monitoring your business communications, tracking your travel patterns, and building detailed profiles of everyone in your professional and personal circles. 3 years? Marcus tried to process the timeline. 3 years ago, Sarah had been battling cancer, fighting a disease that would ultimately take her life. While he'd been focused on her care and maintaining the business during her illness, someone had been quietly infiltrating every aspect of his life. The surveillance began shortly after your wife's death, when you started traveling more frequently and relying more heavily on Captain Morrison for transportation. Someone recognized that your grief had made you more isolated and therefore more vulnerable. The cruelty of the timing was breathtaking. While Marcus had been grieving his wife and struggling to maintain relationships with his daughter and employees, predators had been studying his pain for opportunities to exploit. They'd weaponized his loneliness, turning his isolation into a tactical advantage for their operation. Agent Chen's voice softened slightly. Mr. Holloway, I need to share something else. We've identified the person behind Meridian Aerospace, and it's someone you know. Marcus braced himself for the revelation, though part of him already suspected what he was about to hear. Victoria Sterling.
The name hit Marcus like a physical punch to the chest. Victoria Sterling had been Sarah's oncologist, the physician who'd guided them through the nightmare of cancer treatment and ultimately held Sarah's hand as she died. Dr. Sterling had been more than a doctor. She'd been a friend, a source of strength during the darkest period of Marcus's life. She'd attended Sarah's funeral, had called him periodically to check on his emotional well-being, had even recommended the grief counselor who'd helped him navigate the early months of widowhood. "That's impossible," Marcus said, though even as he spoke, pieces began falling into place with horrible clarity. "Victoria Sterling is a doctor. She saved Sarah's life. Extended it anyway."
Dr. Sterling left medicine 18 months ago, citing burnout and a desire to pursue other interests. She used her medical practice's connections and her personal relationship with you to gather intelligence about your business operations, your health, your emotional state, and your vulnerability to various forms of manipulation. Marcus thought back to his conversations with Dr. Sterling during Sarah's treatment and in the months afterward. She'd asked questions that had seemed like natural expressions of concern, but now revealed themselves as sophisticated intelligence gathering. Questions about his business stress, his travel schedule, his relationships with employees and business partners. She'd been particularly interested in his dependence on Captain Morrison and his routines at Millfield Regional Airport. Dr. Sterling had access to your wife's medical records, which included detailed information about your financial situation, your insurance coverage, and your emergency contacts. She knew when you were most vulnerable, when you were traveling, when you were isolated and grieving. She used your wife's death as an opportunity to gather intelligence for a murder plot. The betrayal was so profound that Marcus couldn't immediately process its full implications. Victoria Sterling had comforted him at Sarah's deathbed, had helped him make impossible decisions about treatment options, had been present for some of the most intimate moments of his grief. She'd seen him cry, had offered professional counseling resources, had checked on his emotional well-being with what seemed like genuine concern. All of it had been a lie. While pretending to care about his healing, she'd been planning his death. Marcus's phone buzzed with an incoming call from Emma. Agent Chen stayed on the line while Marcus answered. "Dad, I've been awake all night thinking about something. Do you remember Dr. Sterling asking questions about your business during Mom's treatment?" "Emma, Agent Chen just told me. Victoria Sterling is behind Meridian Aerospace." The silence on Emma's end was deafening. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a mixture of fury and devastation that Marcus had never heard before. "Dad, she held Mom's hand when she died. She helped us make decisions about hospice care. She attended the funeral and told me how proud Mom would have been of my nursing career." Emma's voice broke slightly. "She used Mom's death to plan your murder." Agent Chen's voice cut through the emotional turmoil with professional focus. "Miss Holloway, we need both of you to think carefully about every interaction you had with Dr. Sterling, both during your mother's treatment and afterward. Any detail, no matter how small, might help us understand the full scope of her operation." Over the next hour, Marcus and Emma constructed a timeline of Dr. Sterling's involvement in their lives that revealed the sophisticated nature of her deception. She'd positioned herself as a trusted family friend while systematically gathering intelligence about Marcus's business operations, his emotional vulnerabilities, and his security arrangements. During Sarah's treatment, Dr. Sterling had encouraged Marcus to maintain his business travel schedule, arguing that Sarah needed him to preserve their financial security for her care. She'd specifically recommended that Marcus continue using Captain Morrison for flights, praising the psychological benefits of maintaining familiar routines during times of crisis. After Sarah's death, Dr. Sterling had stayed in touch under the guise of monitoring Marcus's grief recovery. She'd asked about his business challenges, his relationship with Emma, his plans for the future. Every conversation had been designed to extract information that could be used to plan his murder and the subsequent acquisition of his company.
"There's something else," Agent Chen said. "We've discovered that Dr. Sterling has been involved in similar operations in other cities. 3 other business executives have died in the past 5 years under circumstances that we're now investigating as potential murders. All were successful entrepreneurs with valuable companies,
All had medical relationships with Dr. Sterling or her associates, and all died in ways that initially appeared to be accidents. Marcus felt sick as the implications became clear. Dr. Sterling wasn't just a doctor who'd turned to crime. She was a serial killer who'd built a medical practice as a front for identifying and eliminating wealthy targets. She'd used her position as an oncologist to develop relationships with vulnerable families, gathering intelligence that could be used for financial gain. "How many people has she killed?" Marcus asked. "We're still investigating, but potentially dozens." Her medical practice gave her access to detailed financial information about terminal patients and their families. She could identify targets, assess their vulnerabilities, and plan operations that would appear to be accidents or natural deaths. Emma's voice was sharp with professional outrage. She violated every ethical principle of medical practice. She used people's trust, their pain, their grief as weapons against them. Agent Chen continued her briefing with details that painted an increasingly disturbing picture. Dr. Sterling had built Meridian Aerospace using profits from previous murders, creating a sophisticated business empire that served as both a money laundering operation and a platform for future crimes. The Singapore deal was sabotaged from the beginning. Dr. Sterling had contacts in Southeast Asia who ensured that Holloway Industries would lose the contract, creating financial pressure that would force you to take emergency flights under dangerous conditions. Everything was designed to put you on that plane with her operative. Marcus thought about the months of negotiations, the promising early discussions, the sudden reversal of fortune that had seemed like bad luck, but now revealed itself as deliberate manipulation. Dr. Sterling had been orchestrating his company's financial crisis while pretending to offer emotional support for his personal struggles. "Agent Chen, what about the other employees of Meridian Aerospace? Are they part of this?" "Most of them appear to be legitimate professionals who were recruited with false information about the company's goals and financing. Dr. Sterling is skilled at compartmentalizing her operations, ensuring that most of her employees don't understand the true nature of their work." The phone rang again, this time displaying Rita's number. Agent Chen patched her into the conference call, her voice tense with concern and determination. "Mr. Holloway, Agent Chen told me about Dr. Sterling. I need you to know something. 3 months ago, there was a woman in the diner who seemed very interested in your conversations with Captain Morrison. I mentioned this yesterday, but I just realized something important. She was asking Martha about medical facilities near the airport, claiming she was researching treatment options for a relative. She had the manner of a doctor, professional, authoritative, comfortable discussing medical topics." Marcus felt another piece of the puzzle click into place. "Rita, can you describe her?" "Mid-40s, well-dressed, auburn hair, very confident. She stayed for about an hour, long enough to observe your entire routine with Captain Morrison. She tipped generously and asked specific questions about flight schedules and passenger patterns."
Agent Shen's voice carried new urgency. "Mrs. Vasquez, that's consistent with Dr. Sterling's appearance. She was conducting personal surveillance to supplement the electronic monitoring. She wanted to observe Mr. Holloway's behavior patterns directly, to identify any security measures or unpredictable elements that might complicate her operation." Emma's voice was tight with anger. "She studied our family like lab rats. She watched Mom die, comforted us through our grief, and used everything she learned to plan Dad's murder." The conversation was interrupted by a call from Agent Shen's technical team. She put them on speakerphone, her expression growing increasingly serious as she listened to their report. "Agent Shen, we've analyzed the financial records for Meridian Aerospace and the associated shell companies. The operation is much larger than we initially understood.
Dr. Sterling has been using medical practices in 12 different cities to identify and eliminate business executives, with total profits exceeding $200 million over 5 years. Marcus felt overwhelmed by the scope of the conspiracy. This wasn't just about his company or even his industry. Dr. Sterling had built a nationwide network of medical practices that served as fronts for identifying and murdering successful entrepreneurs. She turned healthcare into a weapon, using people's trust in medical professionals to gather intelligence for systematic assassination. How many people are involved in this operation? We've identified at least 40 individuals across multiple jurisdictions, though most appear to be unwitting participants. Dr. Sterling recruits medical professionals, pilots, security experts, and financial analysts, usually without revealing the true nature of their work. She's built a sophisticated criminal enterprise that operates like a legitimate business. Agent Shen's phone buzzed with an urgent message. She read it quickly, her expression growing grim. "Mr. Holloway, we've just received intelligence that Dr. Sterling is planning to accelerate her timeline. She knows that we've identified her connection to Meridian Aerospace, and she's moving to complete her acquisition of your company before we can build a complete case against her." "What does that mean?" "It means she's going to try to kill you again, probably within the next 24 hours. But this time, she won't rely on subtle methods or elaborate deceptions. She's going to use direct force, and she's willing to accept collateral damage." Marcus felt the familiar chill of vulnerability, but it was now mixed with something else, a determination to stop Dr. Sterling before she could hurt anyone else. Rita's courage had exposed a serial killer who'd been operating with impunity for years. Emma's analytical thinking had helped identify patterns that professional investigators had missed. Together, they'd uncovered a conspiracy that threatened not just Marcus's life, but the lives of countless other potential victims. "Agent Shen, what do you need from us?" "I need you to help us set a trap. Dr. Sterling knows you're hiding, but she doesn't know where. She also doesn't know that we've identified her or understand the scope of her operation. If we can convince her that you're vulnerable and predictable, we might be able to draw her into a situation where we can arrest her and dismantle her entire network." Emma's voice was tight with concern. "You're asking Dad to use himself as bait." "I'm asking him to help us save lives. Dr. Sterling has killed dozens of people and shows no signs of stopping. If we don't end this operation now, she'll continue murdering innocent people to steal their businesses and accumulate wealth." Marcus thought about Sarah's trust in Dr. Sterling, about the comfort she'd taken from her physician's apparent compassion during the darkest moments of her illness. He thought about Rita's children, now living under federal protection because their mother cared enough to speak up. He thought about Captain Morrison's family, targeted for violence because Morrison stood between Dr. Sterling and her objectives.
"I'll do it," Marcus said. "But I want guarantees that Rita and Emma will be protected, no matter what happens to me." "Dad, no!" Emma protested. "We can find another way." "Emma, your mother spent the last months of her life trusting someone who was planning to kill me. Rita saved my life by paying attention to details that trained investigators missed. You've helped uncover a conspiracy that's been operating for years. I won't let Dr. Sterling continue hurting innocent people just because I'm afraid of taking risks." Agent Chen's voice carried professional respect mixed with personal concern. "Mr. Holloway, if we do this, it will be under controlled conditions with extensive backup. You won't be truly alone or unprotected. But you're right. We need to stop her before she kills again." As the call ended, Marcus found himself looking out of the lake where Sarah had found peace during their brief visits here. She had often said that the water reminded her of the persistence of time, the way that storms passed but the lake endured. Now, facing the knowledge that her trusted physician had been planning his murder while comforting them through her death, Marcus understood what Sarah had meant. Dr. Sterling represented the storm, violent, destructive, seemingly overwhelming. But the lake represented something else, the quiet strength that came from enduring, from refusing to be destroyed by forces beyond one's control. Tomorrow, he would help Agent Chen set a trap for a woman who'd turned healing into murder,
who'd corrupted the trust that made medical care possible. But tonight, for the first time in 3 years, Marcus felt connected to something larger than his own survival. Rita's courage, Emma's intelligence, Agent Chen's dedication, these relationships felt more substantial than all the business partnerships he'd cultivated over decades. Dr. Sterling had tried to use his isolation against him, but she'd failed to account for the unexpected connections that could form when people chose to care for strangers. Rita had noticed because she'd paid attention. Emma had helped because she'd chosen forgiveness over resentment. Agent Chen was fighting because she understood that some crimes threatened the foundation of civilized society. Marcus fell asleep that night with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt since Sarah's death, knowing that tomorrow would bring either justice or tragedy, but confident that whatever happened, it would happen in the company of people who'd proven themselves worthy of trust. The trap worked flawlessly. Dr. Sterling arrived at the abandoned warehouse, believing Marcus would be alone and vulnerable. But FBI agents surrounded the building before she could complete her final operation. When confronted with overwhelming evidence, she attempted to negotiate, offering information about her network in exchange for reduced charges. "You don't understand what you're destroying. I built something magnificent, a system that eliminated weak leadership and redistributed resources to stronger hands." But her empire crumbled within weeks. The FBI arrested 43 associates across 12 states, recovering over $200 million in stolen assets. Captain Morrison made a full recovery and returned to flying. Rita received a civilian commendation for her courage, though she insisted she'd simply done what anyone should do. 6 months later, Marcus stood in the airport diner watching Rita serve coffee to travelers, her familiar grace unchanged despite everything that had happened. Emma had moved back home, taking a position at the local children's hospital. Holloway Industries had survived the financial crisis stronger than before. "Another coffee, Mr. Holloway?" Rita asked, smiling. "Please," Marcus replied, finally understanding what Sarah had tried to teach him about the difference between success and significance. Sometimes salvation came not from the people you paid to protect you, but from those who simply chose to care.